Starnes, thank you as always, and they hope it will be a long, hot summer when it comes to this issue, and that being the Trayvon Martin shooting and death and the George Zimmerman verdict of not guilty and the charges that were brought of second-degree murder and the lesser charge of manslaughter. Our guest is Hoover Institution Research Fellow, Professor, and author, Dr. Bruce Thornton. And, Professor, before the break, you were drawing a distinction between prejudice and racism. And you were using the example of how we got into this, how you were answering the question of when somebody who is black, we had a wonderful conversation yesterday, last call of the show, with a person who identified herself as a black female conservative. And she said, I feel people watch me. I feel that racism. And you were answering the question, how do we get beyond that? How do we deal with that? Professor, please continue.
Well, very quickly, prejudice can work the other way. In other words, a black person can have a prejudice. Let's say if he's pulled over by a white cop on a regular basis, he might develop a prejudice against white cops. But that wouldn't be irrational. And remember, we're not saying whether this is in some abstract universe correct or not. We're just saying how do people cope in their daily lives? They cope by learning from what experiences they have. And from those experiences, they often develop prejudices. What you can't do is you can't let those prejudices then go beyond and create your whole worldview and throw everybody who's a member of any category into that mix. So what the race hacks do is they call any display of prejudice racism. But racism is not prejudice. Racism is the belief that every single black person, by nature or if they're wackier, by God, every single one, no matter their education, no matter their job, no matter anything, it's in their DNA, or earlier they would have said it's in their blood. That's racism. Ingrained, unchanging inferiority. And that is gone from our public culture. Doesn't mean you can't find cranks somewhere who believe that, just like you can find cranks who believe the moon landing was filmed in Hollywood. But that's not the problem afflicting the black community. The problem afflicting some parts of the black community, not the whole black community, are dysfunctional cultural habits and patterns that have their origin, I argue, in the 60s, basically. And that is a culture of secularization, of hedonism, the whole if it feels good, do it ethic that has damaged everybody in this country. But for a minority like blacks, it was particularly destructive. So the whole use of rhetoric is the camouflage, the way to hide the other agenda, which is a political agenda, which is a struggle for power on the part of a minority of well-placed, self-proclaimed black spokesmen, activists, intellectuals, the people you see in MSNBC, people going to politics for the most part, etc. And meanwhile, the problems do not get addressed or corrected.
And so, with the new media and talk radio, the original town hall, if you will. Thank you, Rush Limbaugh, for saving talk radio, by the way. I always want to give credit where credit's due. Rarely do I mention other hosts' name, but I must do that in the sense of honoring those who have.
There's the Moses of talk radio.
Yeah,
Rush Limbaugh.
Right. There it is. Well, we'll participate in ourselves, right? But, Professor, as we try to combat this, there has to be a change in not only people like you who are outing the truth, but also it's similar to what we, dare I say, with terrorism, the conversation we have. The idea that we have people stand up who happen to be people of color who challenge this nonsense. I would be outraged if David Duke said, and people recognize David Duke as my leader, okay, because he's white. Now, I would, number of suggestions, but I don't have people on the Jerry Springer Show, represent my race. And if anybody speaks for my race, I think it's an asinine concept, to be perfectly frank. Nonetheless, there are those who have claimed that, and as you said, recognized it by liberal media outlets. Mm-hmm. So is the answer for those conservatives of color to go out and challenge these people and also challenge those people on the very networks that they are spewing their nonsense?
Well, I mean, if they end up on the network, they're just going to be there to be targets of insult. Remember in 1984, all the people once a day had to go and have the 2-minute hate, and there'd be a picture of the enemy of the people, Emmanuel Goldstein, and there'd be the 2-minute hate, and then it'd be done. So conservatives, and I've had this experience myself, by the way, in various venues, you end up, you're only there to be the object of everybody's hatred, right? They're not going to listen to you. You're not going to change anybody's mind. You're just a phony nod to a diversity of views. So I don't think that's so much his answer. I think that people like Thomas Holder, who have been writing on this, Shelby Steele is another, they've been doing this great work, and they'll continue to do it. But I think that, like with most of the problems we have, experience is going to have to be the teacher. You know the old Roman saying, experience is the teacher of fools. Experience is going to have to be the teacher. And I think there's going to be changes in the coming years. The fact that we are becoming a more diverse minority nation, that is, the black population remains about the same, around 12, 13%. But as Hispanics grow, Asians, you have all of these other minorities who simply don't, buy into the whole guilt, narrative as white people do. That's going to change. I think that's going to change the dynamic because there's going to be less traction in that. I mean, how are you going to say to a Hmong peasant who made his way to the United States and can't speak English, but now is the owner of 6 donut stores, right, that somehow he's an oppressor of you, the American-born English-speaking black person? I mean, that's not going to fly. That's just not going to happen. And that's going to translate into political clout, too. And so I think that's simply, here's the sad thing. The black intelligentsia are leading a lot of black people into a dead end, if you look to the future. They're leading them into a dead end because the changing demographics of this country do not favor black people. In other words, as the country becomes less white but stays the same racial black, that is not going to favor or ultimately benefit black people. And so, they need leaders who say, look, let's get back to the central premise of the foundation of this country. It's about individuals who have rights. And superficial skin color, hair texture, all of those things have nothing to do with who you are as an individual and your rights. And until they do that, these problems are simply going to persist.
Bruce Thornton. Professor, I can't add anything but just to express a big thank you for your work. I've posted your article, and many people are liking it, and the readership will continue. And that's what we want. We want to be a venue where we can get the truth out. And sometimes the truth is going to get you called all sorts of names, but that's the gig, and that's the reality. And the alternative is to lie by omission and play the game that inevitably, in this case, would be soft bigotry. Professor, thank you. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Frank.
Take care. All right. Now, an amazing conversation, and we'll post this, obviously. We'll get it going for you tomorrow, and you can check it out on the podcast if you're just joining us. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, AFR Talk. And one of the reasons that since yesterday, and for that matter, mainly through this case, I haven't gotten overly exercised and passionate, if you will, when it comes to the racial arguments that are being put forth, is because I want you to hear my voice not as being reactionary, but someone who is analyzing what we have and putting it forth and saying, okay, here is the evidence, here is what's being said, and here are not only the evidence but also the facts. And here's a greater context to things, and you can evaluate it for yourself. I don't like talking about race. I don't. I think it's awful, and I say on a relatively regular basis that I think when you have a conversation led by Springer Show, yes, you are going to get what you paid for, and that's not going to be a true conversation about how to make things better, because you're starting with a false premise. And while people can disagree specifically on the issue of George Zimmerman and the verdict of not guilty, if they're disagreeing on the evidence, wonderful. If they're disagreeing on the race aspect that has been injected into this, well, then they are buying the hype. And they're buying into people who really, as the professor pointed out, it's a dead end, not only for them, but for our entire country. And it violates what we know, that God created us as unique individuals with specific gifts, unique gifts. And in order to fully reach our potential, we can't have a mob rule society when it comes to debate or law. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. The rest of the stories on the flip side. AFR Talk.